In September 1944, a German commander was surrounded by American forces and given a simple choice: surrender and live, or resist and lose everything. He didn't negotiate. He didn't stay silent. He sent back a message meant to sound heroic. If General Patton wants this fortress, he'll have to kill me. What he didn't realize was that Patton never argued with challenges. He treated them as instructions. What followed wasn't a siege, it wasn't a battle, and it wasn't heroic. It was a 12-hour lesson in what happens when pride meets overwhelming force. The fortress had been standing long before anyone in the valley could remember who built it. Thick stone walls rose from the hills like something grown rather than constructed, shaped by centuries of war and fear. In September of 1944, it was no longer a relic, it was a problem. And problems, General George S. Patton believed, were meant to be removed quickly. American forces had pushed deep into eastern France, advancing faster than German planners had ever expected. Roads were clogged with retreating enemy units, supply columns, and shattered commands trying to reorganize under pressure that never seemed to let up. In the middle of one of the most critical junctions sat the fortress, blocking the shortest supply route for Patton's armor. Inside were nearly 1,500 German troops and a commanding officer who had already decided how the story would end. The German major was not a fool. He knew the war was turning. He knew American artillery outnumbered his guns and American aircraft ruled the sky. But he believed something else more strongly than logic. He believed surrender was dishonor. He believed that dying in command was preferable to living in captivity. And most dangerously of all, he believed the Americans would hesitate. When Patton's messenger arrived under a white flag, the terms were simple: lay down your weapons. No punishment, prisoner of war status, medical care, survival. It was not an insult. It was an offer designed to save lives and time. The major listened, straightened his uniform, and delivered his response with the confidence of a man who believed words could substitute for power. If General Patton wants this fortress, he will have to kill me, the messenger returned. The message was delivered, and for a brief moment, Patton's staff waited for anger or argument. Instead, Patton nodded, almost thoughtfully. There was no raised voice, no dramatic pause, just 4 words that ended the conversation entirely. I can arrange that. Patton did not see the statement as defiance. He saw it as clarity. The major had removed all ambiguity. He did not want negotiation. He wanted death on his own terms. Patton believed in taking people at their word. Orders moved fast, faster than the Germans inside the fortress could imagine. Roads were sealed, not casually but completely. Fields were blocked, communications cut. No supply wagon would get through. No reinforcement would arrive. Every heavy artillery battery within range was repositioned, not for intimidation, but for accuracy. Guns were calibrated, targets assigned. Walls measured not as symbols, but as thickness and stress points. Aircraft were reassigned, not bombers meant to flatten cities, but precision strike planes designed to remove specific problems, command posts, gun emplacements, ammunition stores. Everything that allowed resistance to exist was identified. Then came the loudspeakers. Patton understood that fear works best when it's informed. The German troops were told exactly what would happen and when it would happen. There was no shouting, no insults, just a schedule. Artillery at dawn, airstrikes shortly after, ground assault to follow. Surrender was still available, safety was still guaranteed, but the clock was now visible. Inside the fortress, the night became unbearable. Soldiers whispered. Some stared at the walls that had protected generations and wondered if stone still mattered against modern firepower. Junior officers argued quietly. A few men tried to leave and were shot by their own commander. Discipline held, but belief began to rot. At first light, the guns spoke. Shells did not scatter randomly. They hit the same points again and again. Stone cracked, then failed. Defensive positions that had seemed eternal collapsed into rubble within hours. German guns fired back briefly, then fell silent as American counterfire erased them one by one. The message was clear. Resistance was not bravery. It was suicide. When the aircraft arrived, there was no chaos, just precision. Bombs fell exactly where they were meant to. The command center disappeared in flame and dust. Ammunition stores erupted from the inside out. The main gate ceased to exist. And still, the loudspeaker spoke calmly, explaining what had already happened and what would come next. That was when the first German soldiers surrendered. They came out cautiously, hands raised, faces hollow with exhaustion and relief. A few at first, then more. Word spread faster than fear. The major tried to restore order. He failed. The moment he ordered, men shot for choosing life. Whatever authority he had left evaporated. By mid-morning, the fortress was no longer a fortress. It was a series of broken positions waiting to be cleared. American infantry moved in through every breach at once. Tanks fired point-blank into openings. Engineers collapsed remaining bunkers. Flamethrowers cleared the last pockets of resistance. It was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was the execution of a plan that had already succeeded. The German major was found alone in what remained of his command bunker. He raised his pistol. An American sergeant fired once. The story ended exactly where the major had insisted it would. The fortress fell before noon. When the firing finally stopped, the silence felt unnatural. Smoke drifted through shattered stone corridors where orders had once echoed with confidence. American soldiers moved carefully through the ruins, weapons lowered now, calling out instructions instead of threats. Hands rose from behind broken walls. Helmets were set gently on the ground. Rifles were laid down one by one. The fortress had not been conquered by chaos or rage. It had been dismantled by inevitability. By early afternoon, nearly 1,000 German soldiers were sitting in guarded groups outside the walls they had believed would protect them. Some were wounded, wrapped in field dressings applied by American medics who made no distinction between uniforms. Others stared at the ground, replaying the night they had spent waiting for dawn, knowing exactly what would come and being powerless to stop it. The men who survived understood something their commander never had. Honor meant nothing if it only led to needless death. Inside the fortress, intelligence officers walked through the wreckage with notebooks and cameras. They found unfinished letters, stuffed into pockets, lists scribbled by junior officers, questioning whether resistance made sense anymore. Evidence that morale had collapsed long before the first shell was fired. The German major had believed his defiance would unify his men. Instead, it had isolated him. Leadership built on pride had turned into a cage that trapped everyone beneath it. Patton arrived the next day. There was no speech, no celebration. He walked slowly through the ruins, boots crunching over stone that had once been considered unbreakable. Officers followed him, waiting for some declaration that would turn the battle into legend. None came. He stopped briefly at the place where the major had died, nodded once, and moved on. What did matter to Patton happened outside the walls. He spent time with the wounded prisoners, making sure treatment was being given properly. He reminded his own men that surrender changed everything. Once an enemy laid down his weapon, he was no longer an enemy. He was a responsibility. That line Patton believed had to remain absolute. Without it, discipline dissolved into cruelty. Word of the fortress spread quickly, not because it was unique in scale, but because of how decisively it ended. German commanders heard the story in fragments at first. A fortress reduced in half a day. A commander killed exactly as he'd challenged. An advance delayed barely long enough for the smoke to clear. The story traveled faster than any official report, carried by retreating soldiers and intercepted communications. And it changed behavior. When American units approached other defensive positions and offered surrender, the response shifted. Fewer speeches, fewer dramatic refusals, more white flags, more officers choosing captivity over pointless resistance. German intelligence took note of the pattern. Patton's threats were not threats at all. They were forecasts. If he said something would happen, it happened. No escalation, no theatrics, just action. This predictability became its own weapon. Random brutality creates fear, but it also creates confusion. Patton's method created clarity. Every German commander understood the equation. Surrender meant survival. Defiance meant destruction. The choice was personal, but the outcome was fixed. Back in American lines, officers studied the fortress battle as a case study. Not in rage or revenge, but in efficiency. Preparation had eliminated uncertainty. Coordination had removed chaos. Overwhelming force had shortened the fight and reduced casualties on both sides compared to a prolonged siege. It was warfare, stripped of illusion. The German major's name faded quickly. He had wanted to be remembered as unbreakable. Instead, he became a cautionary example whispered among officers who suddenly understood the cost of dramatic pride. His men paid that price with their lives or their freedom, all for a delay that barely mattered. The road junction was operational by nightfall. Supply convoys rolled through without interruption. Patton's advance continued, relentless and unpaused. The fortress did not slow the war. It only added numbers to a ledger already overflowing with loss. Yet the story lingered, because it raised uncomfortable questions. Was Patton right to accept the challenge? So literally, should he have tried harder to save a man determined to die? Or was respecting a choice, even a fatal one, the truest form of responsibility? There was no clean answer, only consequences. What was clear was this: leadership rooted in ego is not strength. It is liability. The German major believed courage meant refusing to bend. Patton believed leadership meant knowing when resistance served no purpose. The difference between those beliefs decided who lived and who did not. As the war moved on and the map changed daily, the lesson of the fortress stayed with those who learned it the hard way. Grand statements do not intimidate people who are already prepared to act. They only remove doubt, and once doubt is gone, what follows is swift, decisive, and final. The major had demanded death as the price of surrender. Patton paid it without hesitation, and in doing so he taught every commander watching that words spoken in pride can become orders you never intended to give. The war did not pause to reflect on what happened at the fortress. It rarely did. Columns moved forward. Maps were redrawn, and new problems replaced old ones with relentless speed. Yet among the men who had witnessed it, the memory lingered longer than most engagements, not because of the destruction, but because of how little emotion had been involved in delivering it. In the weeks that followed, German resistance along Patton's axis weakened in ways that statistics alone could not explain. Units surrendered earlier. Defensive positions were abandoned without a fight. Officers who might once have made speeches about honor now spoke quietly about survival. The fortress had become more than a ruined position on a map. It had become a reference point, a story that carried a warning sharper than any threat broadcast over loudspeakers. Patton understood this effect instinctively. He never exaggerated the story, never dressed it up for propaganda. He let the truth do the work. A commander had refused surrender. He had been taken at his word. The outcome had been swift and final. Nothing more needed to be added. For his own officers, the lesson went deeper than tactics. Patton reminded them that leadership was not measured by how loudly one declared resolve, but by how many lives one preserved while accomplishing the mission. The German major had confused personal pride with duty. In doing so, he had turned his command into a death sentence for hundreds of men who trusted him. American soldiers who fought through the fortress noticed something else. Once the resistance ended, the brutality ended with it. Prisoners were fed. Wounded men were treated. Guards were firm but not cruel. The contrast was deliberate. It reinforced a line Patton insisted could never blur. Violence was a tool, not an emotion. It had a purpose and an endpoint. As the months passed and Germany's situation worsened, more commanders remembered the fortress when faced with surrender demands. Some later admitted during interrogations that they had thought of that story. In the hours before making their decision, they understood that refusing was not bravery if it changed nothing. It was simply choosing a worse outcome. The German major had wanted to prove something. He wanted his defiance to matter, to echo beyond the stone walls he commanded. In a way, it did, but not as he intended. His stand did not slow the advance, did not alter the course of the war, did not inspire resistance. It taught restraint through fear, clarity through consequence. Patton never spoke of the major again. To him, the matter was settled the moment the challenge was issued. Words had been spoken. Action had followed. That was the end of it. He had no interest in glorifying an enemy who had forced his own men into an unwinnable position. Looking back, the fortress offers an uncomfortable truth about conflict and leadership. Dramatic ultimatums feel powerful when spoken, but they are binding. When you remove compromise from your own position, you hand control to the person who has greater force. Patton understood the dynamic better than most. He did not argue with defiance. He treated it as consent. There is a temptation to romanticize last stands, to see them as proof of character. But war does not reward symbolism. It rewards results. The German major's refusal achieved nothing he intended. His men paid the price. The road was taken. The advance continued. History moved on without him. In contrast, Patton's approach left a measurable impact. Fewer prolonged battles, fewer unnecessary losses, faster progress. His reputation became a silent negotiator that arrived before his troops did. When surrender offers came from his units, they were no longer seen as weakness. They were seen as warnings delivered politely. The fortress still stands in fragments, stones scattered across the hillside, its walls broken in places that were once thought invincible. There is no plaque that tells the story in full, no monument to the man who refused to surrender, just ruins, quiet and unremarkable, like so many others left behind by a war that devoured certainty. What remains is the lesson. Leadership is not about how far you are willing to go to prove a point. It is about knowing when a point no longer needs to be proven. Patton took people at their word, not out of cruelty, but out of efficiency. He understood that clarity saves time and time saves lives. The German major said he would only surrender in death. Patton accepted that statement without debate and acted accordingly. It was not personal, it was professional, and it became one of the clearest examples of what happens when pride meets overwhelming force. In the end, the fortress did not fall because of rage or revenge. It fell because one man believed his words were stronger than reality, and another understood that reality does not negotiate. When challenges are issued to someone already prepared to act, they are not deterrents. They are invitations.